You know that feeling? Just drowning in information, articles, papers, everywhere.
Information overload, definitely.
And you just wish you had a way to cut through it all, get the main points.
Yeah, find the actual insights without reading hundreds of pages.
Exactly. And that's what this is. This is the deep dive. You bring us the sources.
And we dive in.
We roll up our sleeves, and pull out the key stuff for you. So today, we're tackling a research paper. It's right at the cutting edge of AI.
It's called Towards a Deeper Understanding of Reasoning Capabilities in Large Language Models.
Sounds important. It's by Wong, Bäck, Plaat, Stein, and Kononova.
Right. And they're asking a really fundamental question. Can these large language models, these LLMs, actually reason? Or is it just sophisticated pattern matching?
Because we see them doing amazing things, don't we? Acing tests, writing code.
Oh, absolutely. Their performance on static tasks like math problems or coding benchmarks, it's really impressive. The paper notes that right up front.
But the big dream for AI, a lot of it, is about agents acting in the real world, right? Making decisions.
Precisely. Agents that can perceive, decide, and act autonomously. But the real world isn't like a fixed test.
It's dynamic. It changes constantly.
Exactly. It requires adapting, learning over time, remembering things. And that's where current LLMs might struggle.
Okay. So that's the problem this paper digs into. They're great on static data, but can they handle dynamic environments, learn new things on the fly?
Yeah. Can they adapt to novel tasks just using the information they get during the interaction? The paper mentions the limitations like their reliance on statistical prediction, maybe a lack of true long-term memory.
So the core question they're investigating is, can LLM agents learn and adapt in these dynamic settings using just sort of in-context methods? Clever prompting, not full retraining.
That's the heart of it. Can these mechanisms unlock real reasoning and self-learning potential in dynamic situations?
Okay, great setup. So how did they actually test this? What was the experiment?
Well, they took a pretty systematic approach. They grabbed a bunch of popular open source LLMs.
Different sizes.
Yeah, a whole range from, 8 billion parameters, which is relatively small these days, up to 70 billion parameter models. So small, medium, and large.
And they needed a test environment that wasn't static. You mentioned that.
Right. They used a benchmark called Smart Play. It's specifically designed to see how well agents handle dynamic decision-making.
Smart Play. Okay. What kind of challenges are in there?
They used 4 different game environments from it. Each one tests different things. There was a bandit game.
The explore versus exploit problem.
Exactly. Then rock, paper, scissors, which is all about adapting to what your opponent is doing.
Classic.
Then Tower of Hanoi, a real test of planning and spatial reasoning.
Definitely tricky.
And finally, a game called Messenger. That one involved understanding text instructions, navigating a space, and avoiding enemies or obstacles. So a mix of skills.
Got it. So a good range of dynamic challenges. Did they just let the standard LLMs loose on these games?
That was the interesting part. They tested different prompting strategies to see if they could boost the model's abilities without actual fine-tuning, trying to give them sort of cognitive tools through the prompt.
Like telling them how to think about the problem.
Kind of. They tested 3 main strategies. First was reflection.
Reflection.
Yeah. The idea was, after an action, the agent would look back at its recent moves and outcomes within that same game and try to figure out a better strategy going forward.
Like a little internal review session mid-game.
Pretty much.
Okay.
The second strategy was called Oracle, or heuristic mutation.
Oracle. Sounds powerful.
Well, this one worked across games. It tried to generate general rules or heuristics based on performance over multiple past games. Like if I see X, I should generally do Y. And it used an evolutionary approach to refine these rules.
Okay, so reflection is learning within one game. Oracle is learning general rules across many games. What was the third?
The third was Planner. This was forward-looking. The agent simulates possible future moves from where it is now.
Like looking ahead a few steps.
Exactly. Trying to predict which sequence of actions leads to the best outcome. Considering the game state, the goal, maybe even using its reflection insights.
So reflection, Oracle, Planner. 3 ways to prompt the LLM to behave more like it's reasoning, reflecting, learning rules, planning ahead.
Right. And throughout the game, the agent gets feedback rewards for good moves, penalties for bad ones, updates on the game state, just like you would in a real interaction.
Okay, so they set up this complex experiment. What did they find? Did the prompting work? Did the LLMs start reasoning like humans?
Well, the results were really fascinating, and maybe not what you'd initially expect.
Okay, lay it on us. What were the key findings?
First off, something maybe less surprising.
size matters.
Bigger models did better.
Generally, yes. The larger LLMs tended to outperform the smaller ones, and that performance gap got wider on the more complex games.
Like Tower of Hanoi.
Exactly. For Hanoi, the big 70 billion parameter model, LAMA 3.370B, had a much better median score than the 8 billion parameter one, LAMA 38B. So scale helps with complexity. Makes sense. But what about the prompting strategies? Could reflection or planning help the smaller models catch up?
And this is where it gets really interesting and kind of messy.
Uh-oh.
The advanced prompting techniques could sometimes help, especially for the smaller and mid-sized models on those harder tasks.
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes they could reach or even beat the baseline performance of the bigger models that didn't have the special prompts.
Oh, wow. So prompting could level the playing field a bit.
In some cases. The paper mentions, for example, the small 8B model using reflection plus Oracle did better in rock, paper, scissors than the baseline 70B model. And some mid-size models hit the same maximum score as the 70B on Messenger when prompted.
That sounds really promising, like prompting is the key.
And this is a huge,
Yeah.
These benefits were incredibly variable, super inconsistent.
Meaning
Meaning the same strategy, say reflection, might give one model a huge boost on a task, but on another run, or with a slightly different model, it could actually make performance worse than the baseline. Significantly worse.
worse.
The paper shows these massive ranges in the results tables. For a given model and strategy, the minimum score could be terrible, and the maximum could be great. It highlights that these prompting techniques are really brittle right now for dynamic tasks.
Brittle. So fragile. Unreliable.
Exactly. You can't just apply a planning prompt and expect it to consistently improve things. Sometimes it might even derail the model.
That's weird. Why would telling a model to plan make it perform worse?
Well, that leads to another key finding. The downside of too much prompting, especially for the smaller models on the easier tasks.
Too much thinking is bad.
On simple tasks, apparently, yes. Take the bandit game. The best strategy is usually just find the best machine and keep pulling its lever, right? Exploit.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
But when they gave smaller models prompts encouraging reflection or planning, their performance often dropped.
Why?
The researchers think it's because the complex prompt instructions kind of dilute the important information. The reward signals, it adds noise. Or it just makes the model overthink the simple problem.
So instead of just exploiting, it gets stuck exploring or second-guessing itself because the prompt told it to reflect.
That seems to be the idea. It gets distracted from the simple, optimal action. The extra prompt length might also just overwhelm the context window of smaller models.
Wow. Okay, so size matters. Prompting helps sometimes, but is super inconsistent and can even hurt on simple tasks. What about the main question, though? Did any of this look like real emergent reasoning? Like the models were genuinely understanding and learning in a flexible way?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the paper's conclusion on this is pretty stark.
Which is?
Despite all these efforts, different model sizes, sophisticated prompting, they found very little evidence of true emergent reasoning or self-learning comparable to what humans can do in these dynamic tasks.
Little evidence, even with the planning prompts and reflection.
Very little. The models still showed really significant limitations. They struggled consistently with planning, with spatial coordination, with robustly adapting to changing rules or opponent behavior.
So the impressive scores they get on, say, standardized tests or answering questions, that's not translating here.
It seems not. The paper argues pretty strongly that those static benchmarks, where the information is fixed, might not be testing the same kind of reasoning you need for dynamic interaction.
So answering a factual question is different from figuring out how to navigate a maze while avoiding an enemy over multiple steps.
Exactly. These dynamic games expose weaknesses in planning ahead, understanding spatial relationships, following complex rules consistently over time that might be hidden by static tests. What looks like reasoning in one context doesn't necessarily hold up in another, more complex, interactive one.
Okay, let's make this concrete. Can we dive into the specific games and see how they failed? What did the bandit failures look like?
Yeah, so for Bandit, besides that overthinking, where prompts hurt smaller models,
Right, where they explored too much.
it basically showed that for simple exploitation tasks, adding complex reasoning layers via prompts wasn't helpful and could be detrimental, especially if the model wasn't powerful enough to handle the extra cognitive load, so to speak. The simple reactive baseline was sometimes better.
Got it. What about rock, paper, scissors? That needs adaptation.
Here, the larger models did show some ability to adapt and plan against the opponent's patterns, but the smaller models often got stuck.
Stuck how?
Like the example they gave. A Llama 8B model just kept playing paper over and over, even though the opponent was consistently playing scissors and winning. It just couldn't break the losing pattern.
No adaptation.
Very little, yeah. They also noted some models, like a DeepSeek one, sometimes even failed to follow the basic output format rules, which is another type of failure.
Okay, and Tower of Hanoi, the planning puzzle. That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen based on what you've said.
Yeah, it really highlighted the planning and spatial deficits. Failures were common. Models made basic illegal moves, like putting a big disk on a small one.
Seriously, that's a fundamental rule.
Yep, they cite an example of a Mistral Nemo model doing just that. And even when making valid moves, they were incredibly inefficient, taking maybe 30 steps when the optimal is just 7 for 3 disks.
Just flailing around almost.
It seems like it. They might be able to describe the solution in text, perhaps, but actually executing that plan step by step in the interactive environment. Much harder.
And you mentioned the reward was sparse only at the end.
Right, which doesn't help much mid-game. But they did further analysis. Making the puzzle simpler, just 2 disks instead of 3, made a huge difference. Success rates shot up.
Okay, so complexity was a factor.
But more tellingly, when they explicitly showed the model the valid moves it could make at each step, that reduced the illegal moves much more than just tweaking the reward.
So it's not just about learning from reward, it's about fundamentally understanding and following the rules of the space.
That's what it strongly suggests. The core spatial reasoning and rule following seems to be the bottleneck.
And the last game? Messenger. Text, space, enemies.
Yeah, a complex mix. And the failures reflected that. Models struggled with synonyms and instructions, they got lost spatially, they collided with enemies frequently.
Specific examples.
Well, they mentioned one model thinking an airplane was the target object it was supposed to pick up, just basic object identification failure, and spatial awareness was often poor.
So getting lost or bumping into things?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And interestingly, for the biggest model, the LMA70B, the planner strategy sometimes made it too cautious.
Too cautious.
Yeah, it would plan these super careful, long detours to avoid potential enemies, but it took so long it ran out of time and failed the mission.
So even the advanced strategy could backfire.
Absolutely. And again, the follow-up analysis was revealing. Adding better rewards helped models pick up the message more often, but they still struggled to actually reach the final goal because of navigation and avoidance problems. Removing synonyms barely helped.
So the core spatial navigation and interaction problems remained, even with better rewards or simpler language.
Exactly. It reinforces that these are deep-seated limitations in how these models currently interact with dynamic spatial environments.
Okay, so the fancy prompting strategies, reflection, oracle, planner, were inconsistent, brittle, didn't solve the core reasoning issues in these dynamic games. But there was one other approach they tested that seemed simpler and maybe more effective.
Yes. Exactly. They tried using dense rewards.
Dense rewards.
Instead of just one big reward at the very end if you succeed, which is sparse, you give smaller, more frequent rewards along the way, like a little reward for moving closer to the goal or a small penalty for moving away.
Giving more continuous feedback.
Right. A steady stream of guidance.
And did that work better than the complex prompts?
It seemed to show more reliable improvements, particularly in the complex environments. It helped boost the message pickup rate in Messenger. Helped with the 2-disc Hanoi puzzle. The paper suggests that this kind of task-aligned reward shaping might actually be a simpler, more direct, and potentially more effective way to guide learning in these dynamic tasks, compared to trying to craft these really elaborate prompts for reflection or planning that the models struggle to follow consistently.
So clear, step-by-step feedback might be more useful than telling it to think harder in complex ways it can't quite manage yet.
That seems to be a key implication, yes.
Okay, so let's pull all this together. We've got size mattering, prompting being a very mixed bag, inconsistent, brittle, sometimes harmful, and fundamental struggles with planning, spatial reasoning, adaptation in these dynamic game worlds. Plus, dense rewards seeming more helpful. What's the big picture here for you listening to this? What does this tell us about LLMs?
I think the study is a really important reality check. We see LLMs doing incredible things with text, acing static tests.
Yeah, they seem super intelligent sometimes.
They do. They are incredibly powerful language processors and pattern matchers. But this research shows that their ability to translate that into robust reasoning, planning, and flexible adaptation within an unfamiliar dynamic environment, like a game world or potentially the real world, is still quite limited.
So The reasoning we see on a Q&A task might be very different from the reasoning needed to, say, navigate a changing environment or react strategically to an opponent over time.
Exactly that. You can't necessarily assume that success on static benchmarks means the model can handle complex, sequential decision-making that requires spatial awareness, planning, and learning from interaction.
So for you listening, if you're thinking about deploying LLMs in situations that require dynamic adaptation or interaction with a changing world,
You need to be cautious. The claims about emergent reasoning based only on static tests might be overblown. These dynamic environments reveal fundamental challenges that still need solving.
it really underscores that we're not there yet in terms of creating AI agents that are truly intelligent and adaptive in the way humans are in complex, real-world scenarios. Just making models bigger or prompts fancier isn't automatically bridging that gap.
Right. True intelligence in a dynamic world seems to require more than just scaling up language processing.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive. The core takeaway seems to be LLMs show promise, size helps, prompting can offer benefits, but it's inconsistent and brittle in dynamic settings. Crucially, they still face fundamental hurdles with planning, spatial reasoning, and robust adaptation in changing environments.
Which suggests they haven't achieved true, human-like reasoning capabilities in these contexts yet. The study really makes the case for evaluating these models based on what they can do and learn interactively, not just what they can say based on static data.
Absolutely. Which leads us to a final thought, something maybe for you to ponder based on where the paper itself points. If prompting alone isn't the silver bullet for robust reasoning in dynamic worlds,
What else do we need? What are the missing ingredients? The paper hints at possibilities. Maybe better external memory systems. Combining LLMs with more traditional symbolic AI methods for verifiable reasoning.
or maybe incorporating real-world sensory data, multimodal perception, to ground their understanding better.
It definitely feels like there's a lot of exciting research still ahead to figure out how to build truly adaptive reasoning agents.
And that's our deep dive for today. We hope untangling this research paper gave you some valuable insights into the real capabilities and limitations of today's AI.
Trying to cut through the hype and get to the core findings.
Thanks for joining us.